With pleasure. Just leave it there. That's fine. Dear Mr. Paulson, dear Ms. Muller, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, many thanks to the Körber Foundation for organizing this event today. I am particularly grateful for the opportunity to make a few fundamental remarks on our country's current foreign and security policy, and if necessary, and security policy of our country, and share with you. Mom, as you have just said, Mr. Paulson, the timing of our meeting today was not chosen by chance. 3 days ago in Washington, Donald Trump was elected again, and this time as President of the United States of America, was sworn in, and in the 31 days from today, the citizens of our country will elect a new German. Bundestag will be elected. In 32 days' time, as you have just mentioned, 1 day later, will be the 3rd anniversary of the start of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Rarely has a Bundestag election campaign has been so strongly characterized by foreign and security policy as this one. And that's why I'm grateful that we're able to discuss the international challenges. The international challenges of our time and the challenges facing our country. In particular, I would like to explain what is expected of a German government under my leadership, provided that the voters support. Voters give my party and therefore me a mandate on February 2000. Ladies and gentlemen, the major challenges we are facing, first of all, require a clear, that is why I want to start by describing the initial situation for Germany and also for Europe without glossing over anything. The European security architecture, as it has been since the fall of the then so-called Iron Curtain in the 2+4 agreement, in the Budapest Memorandum, in the Charter of Paris, and in the NATO-Russia Founding Act anchored in this European security architecture, does not exist anymore. Our own security is not only abstract, at the same time it is also acutely threatened by the geographically largest country in the world, Russia. Why the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine is therefore not only a turning point for me, as a turning point, as the Federal Chancellor described it in his government statement on February 22, 2022. This war is, as the Federal President described it, a real epochal change. It will therefore be one of the central tasks of the next German government that the European community not only survive this epochal, more or less intact, but that it perhaps even emerges from it a little stronger. The time in which observers expect a linear geohistorical development towards more and more democratic systems of government, wanted to recognize, is undoubtedly also over. We are experiencing an emerging era of a new systemic conflict between liberal democracies on the one hand and anti-liberal autocracies, in which our liberal and democratic model of life is now contested in global competition and must now prove itself anew in global competition. Russia and China are at the forefront of this period of systemic conflict. They are aggressively against the multilateral order, the order which has formed the basis for the coexistence of nations since the creation of the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions. They derive their claims to spheres of influence from the premises of the kind of power politics that we in Europe hoped left far behind us in history, internationally agreed rules and principles, such as the prohibition of wars of aggression and the principle of peaceful conflict resolution, are only applied when it benefits the pursuit of power. We are therefore witnessing an erosion. The principles of the liberal, rules-based international order. No event gives such strong expression to this development as the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which has been going on for almost 11 years, which has now escalated into a full-scale war of aggression since February. I want to say it here, unchanged. We admire the Ukrainian people's will for freedom, who with such determination, this neo-imperialism of its larger neighbor. And on the Russian side, despite enormous human and material losses, no change in thinking has yet been seen. Putin has converted his country to a war economy and continues to rearm massively, far beyond the needs of his own national defense. His ambitions will therefore not be limited to Ukraine, but extends equally to the entire territorial area of the former Soviet Union. Experts give us only a few years before Russia will also be in a position to challenge NATO conventionally. In addition to Russia, a rising and self-confident China is changing the balance of power, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, but also far beyond. In this new era of systemic conflict, Beijing wants to demonstrate that autocracy and state dirigism are superior to the Western model of democracy and a market economy. China's leadership is working purposefully to establish regional supremacy that will end America's influence in the Pacific. And finally, the Chinese goal of so-called reunification with Taiwan is one of the most dangerous conflicts threatening the world and international stability today. China, Russia, but also Iran, North Korea, and others are not working in isolation from each other, on the contrary. Over the course of the past decade, an axis of autocracies has emerged, which has a destabilizing influence in all regions of the world, pushing back the political West and using crisis-ridden developments to its advantage. We are faced with nothing more and nothing less than a revanchist, anti-liberal axis of states that openly seeks systemic competition with liberal democracies. This axis of autocracies, ladies and gentlemen, also supports each other in many ways. Russia is supplied with drones by Iran, semiconductors by China, and troops and ammunition by North Korea. In return, Russia cooperates with Iran in Syria until recently, trains Hamas fighters and supplies cheap oil and gas to China. North Korea is supported by Russia and China in its economic survival and military buildup and development. We are not talking about minor support measures here, but about the strategic balance. Soon, North Korean intercontinental ballistic missiles armed with nuclear warheads could reach the American mainland. Ladies and gentlemen, we will not be able to successfully meet any of these challenges with the current toolbox of our foreign and security policy. We need a change of policy, including in foreign policy and security policy, to safeguard our interests and our values effectively at this time of epochal change, be able to assert them effectively. A federal government under my leadership will accomplish this policy change in 3 steps. Firstly, we will restore Germany's full ability to act in terms of foreign security and European policy. Secondly, we will regain the trust of our partners and allies in the world. And finally, thirdly, we will define strategic priorities and implement them consistently. Let me start with restoring our own ability to act. It begins with ending the government's permanent public bickering. It is the task of the Federal Chancellor to ensure that differences of opinion in his cabinet are resolved internally and that decisions are then jointly represented to the outside world. The public dispute of recent years has meant that neither our partners nor our opponents knew where Germany stood at the forks in the road of international politics. This lack of clarity in our positions will not be repeated under my leadership. Clarity in our positions is not only a question of safeguarding our own interests, but also part of our responsibility as the strongest economy in Europe and the largest member state of the European Union. The handling and style in the cabinet is decisive for ending the public dispute. No less important are efficient mechanisms and structures in which Germany seeks, finds, and implements foreign policy positions. I would like to remind you of this. The last fundamental change to our decision-making structures was the establishment of the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in 1961, and the transformation of the Federal Ministry of Affairs of the Federal Defense Council into a cabinet committee in the year of the Ministry of Defense in the year of 1969, a substantial adjustment of the architecture of our foreign security policy is thus up to 55 years in the past. We must recognize that these structures from the 60s are no longer efficient enough to meet the complex demands of our time. The complexity and interdependence of the challenges for the internal and external security of the Federal Republic of Germany is completely different today than it was 5 decades ago. Crisis-like developments are now occurring with enormous frequency and speed. The crises are becoming the norm in our everyday foreign policy. And finally, the international situation demands a completely different willingness on our part to take on more responsibility in the world. For all these reasons, we will set up a National Security Council in the Federal Chancellery. The Council will include the federal government ministers responsible for internal and external security, representatives of the federal states, as well as the most important federal security authorities. The National Security Council will be the focal point for collective political decision-making by the federal government on all key foreign policy issues: security policy, development policy, and European policy. The federal government will find a common line on every fundamental issue and then defend it jointly. The times when European partners received different and contradictory answers from Berlin, depending on whether they called the Chancellery, the Foreign Office, or one of the ministries, will be a thing of the past. In addition, the National Security Council will be the place for developing a strategic culture in foreign security, development, and European policy. We will also make much more use of the expertise in the foundations, think tanks, and universities in our country. Finally, this also includes that a union-led federal government will provide funds for the establishment of security policy chairs at our universities. Finally, the National Security Council will also bring together all relevant information from the federal government in crisis situations in order to create as comprehensive, common, and uniform a picture of the situation as possible. Adapting the decision-making mechanisms in the federal government also includes improving European and European policy coordination. Over the past 3 years, abstention from voting from Germany has become the rule in the European institutions. In Brussels, there is once again talk of the German vote. I will put an end to this European policy speechlessness. Germany bears responsibility not only for its own interests, but for cohesion throughout Europe. If Germany remains silent, we are not only disregarding our own interests, we are also damaging the ability of the entire European community to act. The Federal Chancellery will therefore become much more involved in key European policy issues in future. After all, I will expect every member of the Cabinet to regularly attend the ministerial councils in Brussels, and my head of the Federal Chancellery will ensure that they do so. Furthermore, I will not appoint anyone as a minister or state secretary for the Union who does not speak at least everyday English. Ladies and gentlemen, restoring Germany's ability to act in foreign policy also includes a fundamental reform of development cooperation. Our Christian view of humanity, allow me to say this with reference to our party name, demands that we help the poorest and weakest in the world. Above all, however, we must also see development policy as an instrument for promoting our strategic interests in the world. That is why we will condition our development policy in future. The prevention of illegal migration, combating terrorism, curbing the geopolitical influence of the axis of autocracies, also the suppression of corruption, and finally, the promotion of export markets for German companies will also be our new benchmarks. To put it very simply and clearly, a country that does not take back its nationals who are obliged to leave the country can no longer receive funds from economic cooperation in future. And if a country has an ambivalent relationship with terrorism, it will also no longer receive development funds from Germany. And in future, development aid projects themselves will generally be carried out by German companies and businesses. In future, development cooperation must no longer be a standalone issue for the German government, detached from our overarching foreign and security policy objectives. Development cooperation must become an integral part of a foreign and economic policy that is primarily guided by our interests. In all of this, I want to emphasize that Africa is a continent of opportunity for us with its young population, its growth potential, and its rich culture and history. Despite the setbacks in the Sahel and the faltering process in Libya, we should not let up or cease our efforts. And not cease our efforts, but turn our attention with renewed energy to this continent, which is so important for the world and is the fastest growing continent in the world. Once the ability to act has been restored, a federal government under my leadership will turn its attention to regaining the lost trust of our partners and allies. Ladies and gentlemen, in recent years, and not just since the year, the impression has often arisen that we tend to subordinate foreign policy principles to domestic political disputes. Hesitation, dithering, and tactics have taken the place of clarity and reliability. The overriding maxim of a union-led federal government will therefore be, Germany can be relied on again. We keep our word. We make decisions, and once a decision has been made, we stick to it. Our partners and allies can rely on us again in future. The most urgent is to repair our relations with our two most important neighbors in Europe, Poland and France. A federal government led by me will end the speechlessness between Berlin and Warsaw from day one. We will treat our neighbors to the east respectfully, and with a view to our checkered history, with empathy. And even more, we are asking Poland to continue to take the lead in and for Europe during its current Council presidency. But against this backdrop, I am, so to speak, symbolically pleased that Poland inaugurated its new embassy under the Linden a few days ago, because this is where our bilateral relations belong, in the political heart of our capital. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, on the 17th of June, let me say a few words about Poland on the 17th of June on 91. Chancellor Helmut Kohl and Prime Minister Bilecki signed the German-Polish Neighborhood Treaty. On the occasion of the 35th anniversary of this German-Polish Neighborhood Treaty, I propose that we sign a German-Polish Friendship Treaty that will raise our bilateral relations to a new level. We will also lead our relations with France into a phase of renewal and deepening. The fact that Germany and France currently hold fundamentally different positions in the European Council must be a thing of the past. In any case, I am determined to use the remaining 2 years of President Emmanuel Macron's term of office to work with him to realize the vision of a sovereign Europe. On my first day in office as Federal Chancellor, I will therefore be traveling to Warsaw and Paris to agree on concrete joint initiatives with Prime Minister Donald Tusk and President Emmanuel Macron. Finally, a federal government led by me will also strengthen our relations with Israel. I will immediately end the de facto export embargo imposed by the current German government. In future, the following will apply. Israel will receive what it needs to exercise its right to self-defense. The concept of reason of state will once again be measured by deeds and not just words. It must once again be unmistakably clear that Germany is not caught between two stools, but is firmly on Israel's side. There will be no doubt about this in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, winning back reliability from our partners applies to larger countries. but also for medium-sized and smaller states in Europe in equal measure. My image of successful German European policy is shaped by my time as a member of the European Parliament and the European policy legacy of Helmut Kohl in particular. One of Germany's key strengths in Europe has always been to include medium-sized and smaller member states, and in Brussels and Strasbourg, as a mediator and mouthpiece for their interests. I will return to this good tradition of European policy in our country. Our partners in the Indo-Pacific also need a signal that our presence on the ground is not limited to the occasional passage of a frigate. Japan, India, Australia, New Zealand, our allies in this geostrategically central region of the world should know that we want to actively contribute to stability and freedom in the region. That is why I am proposing a permanent European naval base in the Indo-Pacific. Let us perhaps focus a little more on this region in the discussion in a moment. Last but not least, we should also dedicate our country more to the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf states. They are seeking contact with Germany and currently feel that they are not being sufficiently recognized politically. I keep hearing about investment projects that do not materialize due to a lack of political interest in Berlin. I want us to engage in more active diplomacy with the Arab states, and this includes efforts to expand the Abraham Accords regionally. This also includes new partnerships in the areas of energy, technology, and investment in the broadest sense. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to move on to the third step following the assumption of office by a federal government led by me, the definition and ultimately the consistent implementation of strategic priorities. The truth is, Germany is not currently setting any strategic priorities, and not just for the last 3 years. The national security strategy of the outgoing government was a first step in the right direction, but it expresses this in every line and also falls far short of what is needed. We are in favor of all that is good in the world, for multilateralism, for a rules-based international order, for ending hunger, for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, for reforming the United Nations, and so on. All these goals are undoubtedly right. But if they are not prioritized, we will not achieve any of them with our limited diplomatic, financial, and military resources. A national security strategy must therefore first define priorities in a 3-step process, then take a realistic inventory of our resources, and then derive concrete measures from this. We will therefore give the National Security Council the lead responsibility for drawing up a new expanded national security strategy. In the first year, I want to present a new national security strategy that actually takes account of the challenges of our time, sets out priorities, realistically describes our resources, and then backs them up with concrete actions that will then apply to the entire federal government. In my view, our 3 strategic priorities are: firstly, to restore our deterrence and defense capabilities; secondly, to strengthen our national ability to act and European sovereignty; and thirdly, to end the Russian war against Ukraine. Our most important strategic priority is probably the restoration of deterrence and defense capability. The key guiding principle will be: we want to be able to defend ourselves so that we do not have to defend ourselves. An investment in our overall defense is therefore the decisive investment in the preservation of our freedom and peace in Europe, because the most important lesson from recent European history is this: strength deters aggressors. Weakness invites aggressors. I want Germany and Europe to be strong with strong armed forces, strong civil defense, and a resilient infrastructure. Perhaps due to current events. European heads of state and government are meeting at the beginning of February to discuss defense cooperation. The new Defense Commissioner Kubilius, whom I met in Brussels a few weeks ago, has put forward a proposal for a European Defense Fund. A 3-digit billion sum is being discussed, which would be generated either by the member states paying into the fund or by raising joint debt on the capital market. Ladies and gentlemen, to put it very clearly, there is undoubtedly a great need in the repositioning of European defense. Maintaining and expanding an independent defense industry is in Europe's strategic interest, because we must be able to defend ourselves and procure the necessary equipment. But I have great doubts whether the underlying causes of our lack of defense capability can be addressed with more money alone, before money can actually have an effective impact. We need a fundamental reform of European and national military procurement. In my view, the 3 S's must be at the heart of this: simplification, standardization, and scale. The European NATO states, I will give you examples, currently develop, produce, and maintain a total of 170 weapon systems. The United States only has 30. Europe alone has 17 different main battle tanks. America has 1 and 29 different types of frigates and destroyers. These redundancies cost a lot of money and waste a lot of potential. I want made in Europe can also match the USA in terms of quality and quantity in our defense industry. And until we devote ourselves to simplification, standardization, and scaling, I believe that new membership finance funds or even joint debt are not expedient. In short, we also need a genuine European internal market for defense equipment. Finally, I would like to turn to another strategic priority: ending the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, let me start by saying this. We all want peace as soon as possible. I certainly don't know anyone who does not share this desire. And in Germany, it is not controversial that we want peace. Our political debate revolves around 2 completely different questions. Firstly, what kind of peace do we want? And secondly, what do we have to do to achieve it? To restore peace in Europe? Let me start with the first question. What kind of peace do we want? You have just said it with your introductory words. The peace we are striving for is a peace in security and freedom. We do not want peace at the price of subjugation and imperialist power. We do not want peace at the cost of our freedom. No, we want a peace in freedom and security that enables us to continue our way of life, our democracy, our liberal society. To continue. And for Ukraine, the most important answer in my view is it must win the war. For me, winning means restoring territorial integrity, with a democratically legitimized government exercising its own state sovereignty. Winning also means that Ukraine must be given complete freedom to choose its political and, if necessary, military alliances. By the way, as it was promised in the Charter of Paris by the Soviet Union and the Budapest Memorandum by Russia, assured. And that is the only reason why Ukraine, and many people no longer know this today, gave up its very large nuclear arsenal. Some of it was scrapped and most of it was handed over to Russia. Today, Ukraine is paying for this disarmament with a war that is aimed at its existence as an independent state. Russia must therefore no longer see any chance of successfully continuing this war militarily. My impression from the last few days is that the new American administration also sees it that way, at least in part. And that presupposes that Ukraine is strong enough to defend itself effectively against this Russian aggression. And ladies and gentlemen, as clear as this is, it must also remain clear. Germany must not become a belligerent in all of this. Germany, precisely for this reason, we must say on behalf of our country that we must support Ukraine with all the diplomatic, financial, humanitarian and military means it needs to exercise its right to self-defense. Right of self-defense. Allow me to make this point. For this very reason, I personally am firmly convinced that the only right way to achieve peace in freedom and security in Ukraine is to continue our consistent support. We must avoid any ambiguity about the path we want to take together. And I also emphasized this to President Zelensky in our third personal conversation last Tuesday evening at a meeting on the margins of the World Economic Forum in Davos. Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about strategic priorities, I must also mention the keyword strategic capability. The lack of strategic culture in our country has often been described, and indeed in central areas of foreign and security policy, government action has hidden behind established language rules. Hidden behind established language. I will give just two examples. Firstly, the Middle East conflict. Anyone who asks about Germany's strategy for resolving this conflict has been given the same answer for many years. We want a two-state solution. But the two-state solution is not a strategy, but merely a conception, the conception of a goal. There is a general lack of clarity about how we want to achieve this goal. Secondly, Iran. The nuclear agreement with Iran has failed because instead of toughness, on the goodwill of a dictatorship, Germany is still holding on to the nuclear agreement, but not because we are convinced that it is the right thing to do, but simply because we have not developed a convincing strategic alternative. Or, the time of the epochal change is therefore too serious for us to continue to be satisfied with our own lack of strategy. For me, strategic capability means that we must finally develop a formative policy in the key foreign and security policy dossiers, that we must move from being a sleeping middle power to a leading middle power. The National Security Council will also contribute to this, make a contribution. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to conclude. We say something about our relations with the United States of America. Let me say it right away. Our alliance with America is and remains, in my view, of paramount importance for security, freedom and prosperity in Europe. Freedom and prosperity in Europe. I am certainly glad that the strongest economy and the strongest military power in the world is a democracy and not an autocracy, and that we are members of a collective defense alliance. There is no other partnership in the world that is characterized by such a depth and breadth of interests and values as the one between Germany and Europe on this side and the United States on the other side of the Atlantic. This bond across the Atlantic has so far held, regardless of which administration has ruled in the White House. In recent weeks, in the face of Donald Trump's inauguration, I have been campaigning for us to not act like a rabbit in front of the snake, but to do our own homework here in Europe first, beforehand. If we want to be taken seriously as equals in Washington, then we as Europeans must put ourselves in a position to take responsibility for our security, for example. Germany and Europe have benefited from the American promise of assistance for 75 years. Now it is up to us to do more for our own security and defense. We must not rely on others to solve our problems. That is why I also see Donald Trump's presidency as an opportunity to strengthen ourselves, Europe. And in the area of trade policy, we must avoid a spiral of tariffs that will make both Europeans and Americans poorer. An EU-led German government will therefore promote a positive agenda that brings our economic areas even closer together. And I am not giving up hope that we may yet reach a transatlantic free trade agreement. In any case, the fact that TTIP was not concluded back then is now paying off. We should make a new attempt at a transatlantic free trade agreement that creates positive benefits for both sides of the Atlantic. However, in Germany, talk of transatlantic relations is usually nostalgically lost in the shared memory of the history of the Cold War. Berlin airlift, Marshall Plan, Kennedy in front of Schöneberg Town Hall, Reagan in front of the Brandenburg Gate. Ladies and gentlemen, these historical landmarks are the memory of German-American relations. But we should nevertheless be honest with each other. Historical nostalgia will get us no further in the present. We must continue to develop our partnership with America pragmatically, without romanticism, but with a clear view, also and especially for our own interests. And this includes dispensing with mutual lecturing each other. Foreign policy cannot consist of wanting to shape the world according to our standards. Foreign policy must be about finding common interests, bridging differences, and enduring contradictions. We should take note of the fact that Donald Trump and the Republican Party have been given a very strong mandate by the American electorate. Instead of lamenting this, we must now concentrate on formulating our own interests. Last but not least, our transatlantic relations also include the South Atlantic. The free trade agreement between the European Union and Mercosur, it must really come now. As Europeans, we cannot afford to continue discussing such a free trade agreement for years to come, neither geostrategically nor economically. In any case, I will work in Brussels to ensure that in future there are only EU-only agreements in future and that they are limited to their essential core, namely the promotion of trade. Now, in this context, I would like to emphasize that a strategic foreign trade policy is much more than mere customs and trade policy. At its core, it must be about a German globalization policy that is guided by our diverse national interests, which are often, not always, but frequently also the interests of Europe. Now to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, rarely in the recent history of our country have we faced such transformative upheavals as we do here and now in foreign and security policy. But I firmly believe that we have every chance, in this time of epochal change, not only to survive, but to move even closer together as a European community. Because we are in this European Union, and I want to include Great Britain in this European Union, even though it is regrettable that it is no longer a member. In this European Union and beyond, we are far more than 450 million Europeans. We are an area of shared values and interests, shared history and culture, deeply rooted in democratic tradition and in the principle of the rule of law. These commonalities are the basis for Europe to maintain its freedom, peace and prosperity, especially in these times of increasing systemic competition. Successfully standing up for this is worth every effort. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion with you. Thank you very much.